Gentlemen at the back, please introduce yourselves clearly and remember to speak in the microphone, otherwise our online audience will not be able to hear you.
Thank you very much. My name is Aurélien Tauby. I'm working for DFID as a conflict advisor. I'm working on Mali. So I'm hearing different perspectives on the factors of fragility in Mali and the response basically to the humanitarian crisis. And it seems to me that we're actually asking the government of Mali, my question is really about the government of Mali and its place in answering actually the calls for response to humanitarian actions, but also restoring a certain legitimacy within the entire territory. It seems to me that we're asking them three types of characteristics to the government of Mali. We're asking it to be strong, actually, and to be able to actually restore the rule of law, deal with fundamentalists' presence, deal with rebel groups, all these sort of things, basically, and strong also in political terms, to be elected, to be legitimate, etc. But at the same time, we're also asking it to be accepted in the whole of Mali, which is a longer-term process, which is something that maybe requires a transformation of the way that is perceived, both in the south and in the north of Mali. What sort of services are being delivered? And so there's a contradiction in that, acting swiftly against security threats and at the same time acting on the more longer term on the transformation of the state. And that also, I think Jeremy Swift sort of underlined that as well, negates also the underlying fragility of the government of Mali, the allegations of corruption, for instance, the inability to deliver services in a very difficult environment for everybody. And so I'd like to hear from our panelists, basically, what should be the priority, actually? Should it be, the emphasis should be on the strong characteristic of the state, or on the accepted side, or whether it's actually on looking at the issues of fragility of the state?
Thank you very much. I've got Peter, and then I'll give the floor to Maya Myler from Oxfam, who will also add some perspective from a recent study that they've done.
I am Peter Tesch. I'm with the Mauritanian British Business Council, and I want to say a few words on behalf of Mali's important neighbor, Mauritania. The Mauritanian government has had no confidence in the Malian government previously, and still has no confidence in the current Malian government. The president, Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz, has clearly stressed that while Mauritania would prefer to see the integrity, national integrity of Mali to be maintained, it wants to see a political solution to the problem or the issue of marginalization of the Tuareg and other northerners. So we talk about ECOWAS, but there should also be the Maghreb part of the Mali problem should be included. On that score, while Algerian links to ACME or AQIM, has been noted, it should be. I've learned from Mauritanian intelligence sources that there is a Moroccan element to Mouayo, because two of his victims was Algerian consul in Gao, and previously they kidnapped and ransomed 8 workers from Polisario camps, foreign 8 workers from Polisario camps. So there's a suspicion in which that link is. And last, because it was mentioned that Mouayo have turned up in Darfur, which is a rumor by some people. The one thing which really sunk my heart last week was a headline over a piece in the Observer by Lindsay Hilton, of all people, talking about Arab jihadis imposing Sharia on black Malians. And I hope we don't get into this kind of discourse and narrative and imagery of Arabs or and other non-Africans, so-called non-Africans like Tuareg, doing something bad to Africans. Because if we're going that way, then we're losing the plot.
Thanks. Can you pass the mic?
Hi, I'm Maya Myler from Oxfam. Thank you very much We released a report 2 weeks ago about the refugee situation in the countries that are hosting Malian refugees, in particular in Niger, Burkina Faso and Mauritania. So just wanted to add a few thoughts on that. What we found is that many of the basic needs have been met, but there have been a number of challenges with the humanitarian response to the refugee crisis. Malnutrition in the camps is still very high, in particular in Niger, as well as in Mauritania. As David mentioned, these communities of refugees are living among some of the most impoverished communities in the Sahel that are still recovering themselves from the food crisis. Many of the refugees are pastoralists, and they've brought tens of thousands of heads of cattle with them. We estimate that in one camp in Burkina Faso, there are, I think, something like 1 in 3, for every one refugee, there are 3 animals. Most of the camps are located by the border with Mali, but there's now a push to move some of the camps further inland, which is good for security, but poses an additional challenge for how to accommodate the cattle, because some of the best pasture is close to the border. So that's putting additional pressure on the host communities as well as the local environment. There are a range of protection concerns. So there are reports of armed groups crossing in from northern Mali and recruiting people, including children. Many of the refugees have also imported cultural practices from northern Mali which pose dilemmas for the humanitarian community related to the legacy of slavery, the fact that some communities within the camps are being called upon to do domestic labor, the fact that refugees are resisting efforts to provide food distributions to individual heads of households and are asking for it to be done through their community leaders, and then there are challenges about how that aid is being distributed on the basis of need. Similarly, education is quite patchy. And then maybe just one final point is that many of the refugees that we have spoken to have said they're not willing to return to Mali until there is lasting, durable peace, which of course is open to multiple definitions, but they do make the point that they have fled many times. This is the 2nd, 3rd or 4th time they find themselves in refugee camps over the last few decades. So all this to say that there is also the refugee dimension to the crisis. The host governments have kept their borders open. They have provided a degree of security, but of course there are concerns about the extent to which they'll be able to do that if the influx continues and if the conflict escalates. And then if I could, just one very quick question. So David said that there needs to be human rights monitoring, and this has come up throughout all the discussions, that there needs to be monitoring to understand the situation, to deter reprisals. We understand that there are 2 human rights monitors at the moment with the UN mission in Bamako. So the question is, what really can be done to get those monitors in place, given that training of troops is going to have limited impact with the accelerated timeline for the deployment of the African troops?
Thank you very much, Maya. There is a colleague at the back, and I'll go to the online audience that is fielding some questions as well.
Hello, can you hear me? My name is Fatima Maiga. I'm from Mali. I'm from Gao. I live and work here in London. Just to answer the question to the gentleman here about Mauritania. Mali has 7 borders. And at the border between us and Mauritania and Algeria and Niger, that is where the Tuaregs are. And the Tuareg problem, Mali always know that it's not just Malian problem, it's a Sahel problem. So if, for instance, instead of trying to find a long-lasting solution to it, we start not believe into one another and blaming each other, it will bring what nobody wants to turn into it. I don't think in Mali nobody speak of well, at least Gao I come from, where the Tuareg, MNLA, who has its headquarters in Mauritania. And the ones who come to Jabali are the members who went to Mauritania, saying that they have, what they call it, to Mauritanian army, but how did they come back to Mali and walk onto Jabali? What we do is try to find, for instance, a long-lasting peace. This means Mali, Algeria, Mauritania, Niger, Burkina Faso to come together to find a solution. That has been going on for a long, long, long time. Malian government has been a corrupt government. Malian army is a shamble. I am from Mali, I have to tell the truth. It has been said, it has been seen. So it's not it's not a black and white. It's not from we don't believe in this one, we don't believe in this person. We have to give hand to each other. If our brothers made a mistake, we have to find a solution to come back to speak with them and finish with this problem. That's what I want to say, because in the north of Mali, where this rebellion always started, the Songhai people are the largest community, but nobody has ever heard of them saying that we have been this. They don't have. They don't even have, for instance, Eminela, who started all this, has facilities, have a lobby all the time on medias, but nobody said that, nobody mandates them to speak for the north, even the Tuareg. So I think it's important that our friends come to me to help us. You know, I mean, meaning that from UK, from France, and so on, that we start to help also them. We have to sit down and speak with each other and be frank with each other, which is lacking with African governments, not just Mali, but all the Sahel people concerned. They don't trust each other. That's how it all started.
Thank you very much. And let me read out one of the questions from the online audience. This is from Ewan Cameron from the UK Ministry of Defence. He asks, other African nations will soon deploy more military forces to Mali to help quell the insurgency. Will this improve or have a worsening effect on the humanitarian situation in Mali? So we have a set of questions, yes, Paul. A set of questions related to the regional dimension, be that the refugee crisis or the role of neighboring countries. Question from DFID about the role of the government of Mali, sort of caught in between, sort of more immediate action and a longer-term transformation, as well as comments on the emergence of a racial narrative, that may be quite disturbing in the context of Mali, and a few others. I don't know who wants to start, and Genevieve and Bruce, just wave if you'd like to address one question or the other. But shall I start with Jeremy? We go this way, and
it's a set of very interesting questions, good questions. The question of what is, there are different things to be done with different ways of doing them. So on the one hand, the government has to be strong to restore the rule of law and deal with fundamentalists, and on the other hand, the solutions have to be accepted with the whole of Mali. There has to be negotiation. There's no obvious answer to that. There has to be, that contradiction has to be settled by very careful negotiation. My worry is that although the president of Mali has said there should be, and the route map says there should be negotiations with the inhabitants of the north that are to produce a solution that's acceptable to the inhabitants of the north, the army, or whichever bit of the army you talk to, doesn't appear to agree with that. So that it has to be negotiated, but there will be. It's not just the government; it's all the context that's coming in of what sort of pressure Captain Sanogo is going to bring on any negotiations and whether he can be avoided. So I think it's a crucial point, but to which there's no obvious answer. The issue about that Maya from Oxfam raised about people, they've done this before. This is there are a lot of the camps along the Algerian border, for example. I visited in 1980-something when there were large numbers of Tuareg from northern Mali and from Niger who were in a series of camps around Tinzaouaten and elsewhere. These people have been in these camps before. They've come back. They've been persuaded to come back. It hasn't worked. It'll be more difficult this time. But obviously, one of the advantages of those camps is we do know where people are, and that there is some experience of dealing with them in those places. It's going to have to be a pretty convincing narrative to get them back, I would have thought. The question about human rights monitoring, two human rights monitors in Bamako is not enough. We need many more, and we need some processes to allow them to do proper work. Our friend from Gao, I agree very strongly. I feel very strongly that negotiations will have to take place with neighbouring countries. The whole basis of negotiations, you pointed out quite correctly, the Sonrai tend to be ignored in these discussions, and the more they're ignored, the more that Sonrai militias are likely to build up, which can then become an obstacle to peace. I mean, Gandakoi is not a future model for government in that region. So we have to take into account and get the Sonrai and others, many others, into the negotiations. And the last question that I want to address is about the person from the Ministry of Defence. The regional forces. The regional forces are, we're not sure. The only ones who have any desert experience are the Chadians, who there are some doubts about to what extent they are a national army and to what extent they are local ethnic militias with warlords at the top of them. But they definitely know about fighting in the desert. I heard the Nigerian foreign minister say, oh, our forces know all about fighting in the desert. They've trained in northern Nigeria. That is just not true. They're very different places. The Nigerian forces have a very bad history of human rights abuse in the cities of northern Nigeria. Some of the other regional forces come from places where there are horrific stories of abuse. The regional forces could be as much a problem as a solution, and I'm very worried about the regional forces.
Thank you very much, George. David, would like to?
Okay, thank you. Maybe to start off on some of the humanitarian questions and a couple comments on the others. On the refugee situation, just to complement what was said, I agree with the points that were raised by Oxfam as issues that need to be addressed. Education, I just would like to push that a little bit further. Very little was done in terms of education in these camps. Funding for that was actually quite hard to come by. Hopefully that will improve as time goes by, but this is a very big lost opportunity which contributes, I think in our view, to increased recruitment of young adults who could be in school. So I think that's something to highlight among the various lists. Secondly, in talking about people whom I returned, I've been to all the camps, including those in Algeria, and I do hear the same thing. It's almost word for word what was reported. They've been through this before. They really want to see a credible peace, not just a piece of paper that's signed, something that they actually believe in. And I got the sense that nobody was thinking that they were staying for weeks or months, but for a longer period of time. The IDPs, on the other hand, are a different scenario. People either stayed or left the country for very specific reasons. And those who stayed are probably within the country, even if they're displaced, are probably more likely to return home once a degree of stability and transport is opened back to the north. So I think there you will see a higher rate of return than from refugees. And initial reports that HCR has done after the intervention confirms that among refugees, very little interest in returning. And then a final note on the refugee side, I think UNHCR recognizes that there's a need to do more thinking on how to work with pastoralists in a refugee type situation and are committed to doing so. I think they wanted to start, this is a discussion we had last year with them, late last year before this current intervention. They had wanted to at that time to start working specifically in Niger as there were some good initiatives already underway for that. And I think, but there is a bigger lesson that needs to be pulled from this is how to work with them in the future. And frankly, in the evaluation that we did for the food nutrition response as well, which was generally considered to be a positive response, the support to pastoralists, however, was flagged once again as an area where we should do more thinking on how better to provide appropriate support to them. On the other humanitarian question, which was what will be the impact of further deployments from ECOWAS Chadian forces, it all depends on how it works. But let me say this. We had done some contingency planning before all of this, late last year. Came up with several contingencies. Frankly, whatever we looked at looked like it would make the situation worse. We looked at the possibility of armed groups like Mujahideen and Ansar-Din moving south would have had a humanitarian impact. We looked at the possibility of an increase in political instability in Bamako and in the political transition, which we thought would have a greater humanitarian impact. We looked at a military intervention, more the what was planned, which was a retraining of the Malian army and then reinforced by ECOWAS-led forces, as also having increased humanitarian implications. We saw doing nothing as probably contributing to an aggravation of humanitarian conditions. As you said, it's a mess. And there's a consequence to being in a mess. You can't, left or right, you're going to have a problem. There's going to be consequences. And I think we have to understand that's the environment in which we're working right now, in which hard and difficult decisions will have to be made on how to move forward, where it's not exactly clear. And it will take very clear thinking, clear understanding of the reality on the ground, because sometimes this gets very remote when I hear how people talk about it outside of Mali. So a good, clear understanding on the ground will be important regardless of what scenario we talk about going forward. And then just a couple of other things to touch upon. The question over Mauritania and the perceptions and so forth. I do think we have to understand perceptions are important, whether we agree with the perceptions or not. One of the perceptions that we have to deal with, I think, is the perception among many Malians in the south that the international community is primarily concerned about the well-being of the communities in the north, particularly the Tuareg. And that causes resentment, and it's naive to ignore that perception. It's one reason why I constantly highlight, which I'm supposed to do as humanitarian coordinator, the broad humanitarian needs in the whole of Mali, because there is a need to support the population as a whole. But we should not underestimate that. And I made several trips to Mali since this crisis began, first starting in March, continuing up until last week, in fact. And it's interesting to test the mood during that period of time. Initially, very hard feelings about what happened in the north, then a cooling off, I would say, in June, July period, leading up actually to the end of Ramadan, where it seemed there was actually a window of opportunity for constructive negotiations, a willingness to talk about this, and then a hardening of that position starting, I would say, in September of October. We could go into the details about that, but there's a need to understand the rise and fall of emotions as these things go forward. And any political process needs to take that into account. Human rights monitoring, that is now to be the responsibility of the UN office in Mali, UNOM, another acronym from the United Nations for all of you, which is now just in its embryonic stage. It is to have human rights monitors. It's supposed to have very few human rights monitors at the moment, but I think there is a cry for more human rights support to come in because, as was said, 2 or 3 is not going to do what's required there. You need a much stronger base if that's going to be effective, and they need to have relatively free access to move around in order to deal with the number of allegations that we're hearing about. And then one final point, and it goes back to the first question about strong or fragility or all of those points that were raised. For me, I think the real issue here is whether the international community can, one, become totally coherent in its approach to Mali, and I think there will be a greater attempt on that. A lot of initiatives coming and going on this, and secondly, it needs to be enduring to see this through. This is not a 6-month project or a 12-month project. This is not to get through just the elections, whether they're in July or later in the year. This is a multi-year intensive engagement that's required to try to keep things as reasonably on track as possible to see through the multiple crises that have been described here. Without that, it's very easy to see and imagine all the multiple scenarios that have been outlined that could lead to a very difficult situation in the months and years to come, which will keep me or my successors fully employed as humanitarian coordinators, and I would like to retire from that business. Thank you.
Ideally. Andy, do you have any comments you want to respond?
Just very briefly, the colleague from DFID laid out three incredibly challenging kind of alternative focuses for action. And I can't really imagine making progress on any of them without a different kind of political leadership at the centre. But there are some really tough features of the situation in terms of moving to that, as Jeremy outlined, particularly the ongoing role of the military and SONOGO and so on. But I find it very difficult to imagine on any of those axes real progress without that. So,
Bruce and yes.
Yeah, let me just follow up on what Andy said and come back to that first set of questions that was asked about what should the international community prioritize in looking at the Malian state. I think the leadership and political vision of Mali's political elite, particularly in Bamako over the last year, has just been striking in its absence. And what I think we should be looking for in any government or state structure that comes out of whatever process is taking shape right now, when we talk about having a legitimate government, what do we need? We need a government that's inclusive. It needs to represent not just Southerners and Northerners, not just Tuareg and non-Tuareg, but it needs to represent the interests of ordinary Malians. For the longest time, Malians have felt that the political system is entirely geared toward protecting the interest of elites, whether they be Northern or Southern. And then secondly, it needs to be representative in a broader sense, that just speaking for the interests of those that massive ordinary non-elite Malians. And then the last thing, and this fits in with what Andy was just saying, the political leadership in Bamako needs to offer a vision for a better future. And so far the discussion in Bamako has been uniquely, I think, about who gets to have a seat at the table and not what they're actually going to talk about or do once they get to the table. So I know that all the Malians I know yearn for a strong, stable government that they can all get along within. And so far the inability of the political class to respond to that demand, I think, has been really disheartening. And then just I want to address that last question that was posed online about the risks or opportunities posed by the involvement of African militaries. I think back to the involvement of ECOWAS forces in Liberia in the early and mid-1990s, when there was a group called ECOMOG, led by the Nigerians, and at the time that acronym was said to stand for Every Car or Movable Object Gone. So I certainly don't want to see a repeat of that, and I think the French government should be very cautious in even making statements now about some kind of hasty withdrawal of its forces, because it's not clear to me that the West Africans are ready or able to stand up in place of the French.
Thank you, Bruce and Geneviève.
Yes, thank you. Just on the last question, I won't comment on whether I believe that the military intervention by African states will improve the situation or worsen it, but certainly to say that we urge all these governments who are deploying troops, both as they're bilaterally and also as part of ECOWAS, to issue clear directives and ensure that their staff are trained with regards to human rights issues, issue clear directives to prevent any violations by the troops and enforce them. We also are very particularly concerned that there are protocols to be put in place, including coordination protocols between all these forces, so that any children who would have been, utilized by any of the armed groups coming in contact with these troops would be handled with the appropriate procedures and care and in respect of their rights, and handed over to those who can assist in their reintegration. And finally, a couple more things. Certainly, as their mandate seems to be fairly unequivocally to support Malian armed forces, but whereas everybody has commented on the weakness of those forces, we must be very careful in defining a protection of civilians mandate for these troops, especially if we accept that it's very likely that some violations might be committed by the Malian forces themselves, and how would these international forces therefore react in protecting civilians, and what would they be authorized to do would be very important in terms of the credibility of the intervention, its ability to lead to lasting, sustainable peace. And finally, we advocate that they try not to get involved in the delivery of humanitarian assistance, so as not to confuse or blur the lines with the work that humanitarians are trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got time for another round of questions. If you keep your questions and comments brief, then we can go back to the panel. Yeah, colleague here.
Hi, I'm Nicoletta Antonini. I work for Internews Europe. Working for a media NGO, of course, my first question is about information. And knowing that all the radios in the north have been under the control of the Islamists since March 2012, I was wondering if the humanitarian actors have other communication systems in place to communicate with the population and with the beneficiaries. And if not, if there is actually an interest in this area, and if you think that it is a priority or not.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, to take this one?
Sure, okay. Yeah, I think right now that is a very difficult thing. In fact, a lot of our information that we were getting was via cell phone and other types of means, which became difficult when the conflict entered this current phase. We were receiving a great deal of information. There was also regular movement. Actually, movement between the north and south was not at all impossible. And talking to people who were perhaps part of a crisis committee that organized humanitarian assistance, you could do that face to face in Bamako, even though they were based in Gao or other parts of the north. So it was at that level that this kind of communication, I guess you would say, took place. But the radio type, no. Would it be useful? I think as we go forward, anything of that nature that would allow appropriate messages to get out would be of course useful. So that's something perhaps that could be explored.
And Jeremy, do you want to add something?
Can I just support that? I mean, at the beginning of this crisis, I and several people I knew were in regular cell phone, sat phone contact with people on the ground, and that seems to have gone downhill rather surprisingly. But one of the lessons I've drawn from what's happened so far is the absolute importance of good information, and that turns out to make an enormous difference to what happens. And the role of radio in that, I think, needs to be further investigated and further strengthened, because it looks as though that's one of the ways that one is going to be able to get reasonable information out from a situation where information is absolutely essential.
Thanks, Jeremy. If there is no other, yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Stephen Jones. I'm a PhD student working on rural water in Mali. My question is about the role of potential external mediation in any political processes, particularly in Bamako, because we talked about the role of other African troops in the military context, but I wondered if there's any role for regional mediation, and if so, who might be potentially placed to support that.
Anybody wants to take the question on reconciliation? Bruce?
I'll take a stab at that, and basically I can say who's not appropriate for regional mediation, and that's the people who've been entrusted with it so far. President Compaoré in Burkina Faso and President Ouattara in Cote d'Ivoire got themselves very quickly a bad name in Bamako for seeming to manipulate actors on all sides for their own personal, national, and economic interests. So I think what the political class in Bamako needs is not more outside mediators. I think they need a sense that it's really down to them to stand up and address the issues confronting their nation, and maybe they need a sense that no one's going to solve this problem for them. That it could well be that the surfeit of mediators over the last 12 months has actually delayed a meaningful solution. So I certainly wouldn't be optimistic.
Okay. But Jeremy wants to add something, and maybe in the meantime we can try and bring Bruce back online.
No, just to add that the Prodi, the Romano Prodi, has not been a wonderful success either. But what there are, I think, there are potential Malian mediators. There are, despite the corruption and the failure of the political class generally, there are throughout Malian society people who, some of them have experience of negotiating previous regional Tuareg upsets, and the famous Flamme de la Paix, when a huge heap of small arms was burnt in Timbuktu, that was largely negotiated by Malian negotiators. So I think a priority is to identify and bring forward and support the Malian mediators, because they certainly will be a great deal better than the international ones so far.
Okay, if there is no further question or comment, what I'll do is just go back one last time to the panel for any final remarks, if you have anything to add. But there are more questions trickling through, please.
My name is James Hackett. I'm from the IISS here in London. We've heard from all the panelists, I think, about the need for long-term security force construction, I suppose it is in Mali, rather than reconstruction. I've heard also about the reported announcements that the French are considering starting to pull out some of their forces in March. Meanwhile, we've heard about capacity problems with AFISMA, and that's not just capacity problems in training, it's also the need for logistic support and financial assistance. And also the longer-term EU training mission. I don't think that's even up and running yet. So the time between that getting up and running and deploying trained troops will be a period of some months in the meantime, at the least rather. So how do you actually bridge the security gap in the short to medium term to allow agencies to work effectively on the ground? Is that actually possible? Or are agencies realizing they have to work amidst instability in Mali on the ground?
Thanks. This is really a final call for questions rather than carrying on. If there is any more comments or questions, please, sort of ask now. Otherwise, I'll go back to the panelists for a reply to this question and then any final comments. No? Okay. Geneviève, do you want to start? If you're not addressing the question, just any final remarks you may have, and Bruce, you may want to resume afterwards.
I finished with the remarks that I was giving that seemed to cut out right around the time I was wrapping up, so I don't have anything else to add right now.
Okay, do you have any final remarks? We're going to close after this.
Not on my end.
Okay. Geneviève?
No, the one thing I want to say, because I'm sure David will answer this latest question about access without the security apparatus. Certainly what we're trying to do with this risk management framework that we're trying to strengthen is indeed to put in place the possibility to support remote programming without the presence of UN staff, humanitarian organization staff on the ground for a few weeks, unfortunately, which is always, a last resort. But that's part of the equation, is to try to support that and manage the additional risk that creates. But otherwise, no additional comments. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Geneviève. And before I come to the last three panelists, I'll add another question that's come from the online audience. Luca Gefeller from Minority Rights Group International asks, are there any forward-looking thoughts on how to include northern civil society organizations, especially community-based ones, in peace-building efforts? And Andy, do you want to carry on with your final remarks?
Yeah, not directly to those questions. Just the final comment is that on a broader canvas, I think we need to learn from the kind of images that were projected of Mali at different points. I mean, it's not so long ago that it was on, you know, far from being on the fragiles list, was actually on the list of, you know, shining successes in terms of both political and economic development. So there is, but we've heard from all the panelists this sense that there were underlying currents that were very disturbing going back a long way. So it's also just my concluding comment would be to be very careful of the images that we construct in working in development, just as a broad thing.
David, do you want to address the two questions and add any final thought?
Yeah, just on the question of whether we're not dependent upon a fully secure environment to be put in place or that these forces be there to work. It's not currently the case anyway, and we still want to work there. So just as Genevieve said, we need to put the right systems in place both to be able to access, which I talked about earlier, but also to monitor and manage the risk of working in areas of high instability. And that's what's going to be increasingly put in place. Elements of it are already there. We need to be able to adapt to the situation as it arises, including if it were to deteriorate. So that's how we will work on that. Maybe final thoughts only that, you know, I don't think, as in all things, we should become overly pessimistic just by listing out all of the challenges. The fact that we know what the challenges are is a start, and I think there is much to be done. There is much that can be done, and we just need to get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jeremy, any particular comments?
Well, just
on the civil society organization?
on those two questions of there are northern civil society organisations, both formal organisations and informal customary institutions, which I think should be involved. So the answer to that question is yes, we need to identify those and work with those on peace building. On the question about the security gap, I think that's a very important question, and it involves largely what the French are going to do. The French moved in very fast and were widely praised for doing that, and maybe it was good, maybe it wasn't. I think in retrospect we will come to see that the fundamentalists' movement north and south of the river towards the two towns was probably, I don't believe they were intending to go and take Bamako. I think that would have been completely mad. I think that they were testing, they were seeing what the reactions would be. They were possibly trying to bring the French in, because that, I think, has worked well from their point of view. The French are talking about getting out quickly. One can understand completely why. They don't want to be dragged into a sort of West African Afghanistan. But I think that it's tremendously important that the French don't leave rapidly. They are the only, for the moment, probably the only real guarantor of some sort of possible protection of human rights, some sort of possible decent election. I mean, there's a tremendous danger in trying to hurry these things up. Elections in July, madness. French out in 2 weeks' time, madness in my view. So I think if we've got any possibility of influencing the French, it must be to stay for the moment until some of these alternatives can be really marshalled, because the regional forces need training, they need equipping, the Malian army needs to be put back together again. A lot of things need to be done, and if the whole business goes too fast, we'll be back into a state of absolute chaos and guerrilla warfare and all that goes with that.
But thank you so much to all the panelists for, I think, what has been a very informative and rich, discussion. I think what I take away from the discussion today is really the need to ensure that we have a much more granular understanding of the situation on the ground, that, before we venture into actions or analysis, that are very easily done from the outside, but also, you know, the importance of being careful with narratives and how we construct those, and at the same time, you know, to be prepared to be in for the long term, because this is a crisis that, you know, will have to be dealt with for some time to come. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking the panelists today, including Geneviève and Bruce in the US, and our panelists here. Thank you very much.